This morning we are continuing our summer sermon series, Impressions, How the Arts Nurture Spirituality. And throughout this summer we have been exploring how different art forms form us in our relationship with God, ourselves, and others. A few weeks ago, Jared kicked off the sermon series by talking about how art helps us to expand possibilities, to think of things not only as they are, but to help us to see how the world could be, how God is calling it to be, how God is calling each of us to be. Art helps us to see new possibilities. Last week, we looked at how art can help to cultivate hope. We learned about Afrofuturism, a creative interdisciplinary aesthetic that weaves together history, science fiction, and technology to imaginatively explore African American and African diasporic experiences, cultures, histories, and futures. Afrofuturism centers the Black imagination and liberation, and it reclaims both the past and the future. It imagines a future of Black liberation, sovereignty, and the flourishing of Black American and African diasporic communities. And in this way, Afrofuturism offers hope. This week, we're going to turn our attention to yet another art form. This week, we are focusing on poetry. And we're going to look at how poetry can function as a form of prayer, both reading poetry and writing it. We'll see how it can be a practice that helps us to connect with the divine and with the Spirit of God that dwells deep inside of each of us. Our scripture reading for today comes from the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is one of the longest books in the Bible. It consists of 150 poems. The book of Psalms consists of 150 poems. Originally, these poems were songs that were often sung in worship, often put to music and celebrated as communities gathered together. And over time, they were collected and compiled and turned into what is often referred to as the Psalter. One of the things that I love about the book of Psalms, this book of 150 poems, is there is no filter on them. You have psalms and poems that talk about heartbreak and anger with God. You have psalms and poems that talk about God's grandeur and glory. You have psalms that are written right from the heart. There is no filter on the psalms. Perhaps that's why people, both Jews and later Christians, have turned to the Psalms time and time again. They have turned to this poetry as a way to pray, often when people don't know what words to use. Our scripture, this reading, is Psalm 121. It's a psalm of assurance and trust in God. And I invite you this morning to let your spirit settle as we hear the Spirit of God speaking to us, the church. The psalmist writes these words, reading from the New International Version. He writes, "I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot slip. God who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, God who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. God will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore." Friends, this is God's holy wisdom, God's holy word. Thanks be to God. My love of poetry came from my Grandma Tiffany, my maternal grandmother, who turned 102 years young earlier this year. Growing up, my younger brother Mark and I would often spend summer vacations at my grandmother and grandfather's house, a large ranch-style house located in the suburbs of St. Paul, Minnesota. My grandmother's house was large and long, and my brother loved running through the corridors. We would race each other back and forth, timing each other to see who was the fastest. When our cousins would come over, we would play hide and go seek. We'd sneak into spare bedrooms and tuck ourselves under extra blankets. We would hide in the closets, keeping the doors open just a little, because we weren't quite ready to be completely in the dark. My grandmother, a lifelong Presbyterian, was a member at the House of Hope Presbyterian Church in St. Paul, and she rarely missed a Sunday. That meant when we went to visit her, we were in church on Sundays. We'd often join her sitting in the same pew week after week. Every week, the House of Hope would print their bulletin with a different quote or poem on the front of the bulletin. And whenever one of these poems or quotes spoke to my grandmother, she would take the bulletin home with her and then carefully cut out the poems and quotes and put them on her writing desk. Similarly, when she gathered with friends or prayer groups and someone read a prayer or a poem that resonated with her, she'd ask them to send it to her. And then she would carefully rewrite the prayers and poems in her own cursive handwriting. Poems she especially she broke out the calligraphy for. It was beautiful. My grandmother had poems and scriptures all around her house, including on her writing desk. And there were two poems that I remember always being there. The first poem or poetic writing that stayed on her desk was this one. It reads, "Count these among your gifts, the friendly morning sky, the peaceful night, all the colors, beauties, and splendors of a living earth." The second poem or prayer she kept on her desk was Psalm 121, which we heard earlier. The psalm, which includes these words, "I lift my eyes to the mountains. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot slip. God who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, God who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. God will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore." I never asked my grandmother why she kept Psalm 121 on her desk and why she turned to this psalm, this prayer, this poem time and time again. I imagine it's because life was not always easy, and the psalmist's question, "Where does my help come from?" is one that she asked in earnest time and time again. I imagine my grandmother, like generations of Jews and later Christians who have also turned to this poetic psalm, found comfort and reassurance in it. As the psalmist writes, responding to his own question, "My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." The psalm, of course, ends with a blessing, a reassurance of trust and faith in God's presence, saying, "The Lord will keep you from all harm. God will watch over your life. The Lord will watch your coming and your going forth now and forevermore." My grandmother kept Psalm 121 and the quote I read earlier on her desk, but it wasn't just these two. My grandmother placed poems and psalms and prayers all around her house. She used poems as impromptu bookmarks. She set out index cards with scribbled lines from Goethe on her bedside table. She taped prayers onto the glass window that she looked out as she washed the dishes each day. She loved to pray poetry as she washed the dishes in the morning. My love of poetry and prayer, my love of poetry as prayer came from my grandmother. And as I would walk around her house, I would look for these poems and prayers as if they were sacred treasure. When I found a poem that was secretly tucked into a book, I would be filled with joy and delight. In the midst of running around her corridors and her alleyways, I would often slow down when I saw a poem posted on a window or on a picture frame, looking at those poems that were hidden in plain sight, on a bathroom mirror or the kitchen windowsill. I'd often rewrite the poems and prayers in my own journal so that I could add them to my own treasure trove. Today I have several of my grandmother's poems and prayers that she carefully cut out and kept, and like her, I've placed them all around my apartment. On my bathroom mirror, on my desk, in my journal. And additionally, over the years, I've added more poems and poets that speak to me. Poems by Mary Oliver and John O'Donohue and many others. If you've ever tried to read a poem fast and rush through it, you know it just doesn't work. Often the cadences and the ways that the words are strung together can trip you up and leave you tongue-tied. Poetry, like prayer, requires us to slow down, to reorient ourselves, to linger a little while longer, to savor the moment, to suspend reality, and to lean into metaphor, to let our imagination catch fire, and to notice the fire that is burning deep within us. Poetry, like prayer, poetry as prayer, invites us to listen, to find new rhythms, to slow down, to savor life, to find beauty, to find grace. Reading poetry has long been a spiritual practice for me. However, over my 34 years of life, I've never actually written it. And so today, as we think about poetry as an art form, as a spiritual practice that shapes us and our spirituality, I thought it would be interesting to talk to two people who write poetry as one of their spiritual practices. It would be interesting to hear from poets themselves. So this morning, I have the honor of having a conversation with two writers in our congregation. Miriam Zanders, who's a writer who is currently in an MFA program at UMKC, and Ann Parr, who is a musician and writer among many other things. Ann earned an MFA in writing for children and teens from Vermont College, and she currently teaches poetry. So let's give them a round of applause as they join us this morning. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you both for joining us. So today we are talking about poetry as a spiritual practice. And when I was thinking about this sermon, you both came to mind because of the great writing that you do, both professionally and in your own personal life. So I'd love just to hear a little bit about who you are and how you started either writing or teaching poetry. So Ann, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey with poetry.
Thank you, Kristin, for inviting both of us to be part of this. It's really special to be here, and I think this is my 3rd week anniversary of being a member of Seconds.
Whoa!
So I feel like I'm with family. My introduction to poetry is rather ragged. I did not appreciate poetry and didn't study it very well in either college or graduate school. And then when I was living in Salina, and a director of an addiction treatment center came to me and asked if I would teach a poetry workshop. And I thought, that's strange. But I agreed to do it, and I learned a whole lot about poetry and how personal it is and how it doesn't have to be structured and trained. It can come from the heart. So we did that workshop. Then I moved to Kansas City, and I heard about Healing House, which is in the Northeast, which is a very successful addiction treatment center. So I went to their administration and said, this is what I did in Salina. Would you give me a chance here? And they said, of course. And I taught my first poetry class there in January of 2019 on a Thursday afternoon, and I'm still doing it on Thursday afternoons. They wrote such beautiful poetry, talking about their pain and their hopes and their past and their hope for future. And I'd bring those poems home with me, and I could not throw them away. So I started piling them on the floor in my office until I couldn't walk around anymore. And I wrote a book, put together a book of 305 poems called Lurking Within, which comes from one of the haiku poems that one of the Healing House people did. I love working with them, and I think they might like it too because we keep it free. No spelling, no grammar, no rhyming, just write it from your heart. And so I have another floor full of poems. I don't know what I'm going to do with those. But I also think it's very special for them because the rest of their time at Healing House is pretty structured and maybe kind of rigid in terms of the training they go through. And so I come along and I say, it's free. Write whatever you want. And they say, but how many lines? And I say, you decide. Well, should it rhyme? Well, you decide. It's free. And so we have a very good time.
Wonderful. Miriam, what about yourself? Share.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. I'm Miriam Zanders. Grew up in Washington, D.C., and I'm migrated here to Kansas City with my lovely wife, Margie Singleton. We decided to come here because she has muscular dystrophy, and she's struggling with her muscles wanting to do what they want to do. And she decided she wanted to be here with the family she grew up with. I am somewhat of a closeted poet, and I guess I'm out it now. But I think I began a process of poetry at a very young age, before I could really read or write. At age 5 years old, I remember sitting on the floor watching my mother iron. And I asked her the question, what are we here for? And I think that's a very profound question for a child so young. So I say that poetry is a part of me. It's just something that I think I kind of walked into, this need to inquire. I think that's a part of poetry, to inquire about the world around you. And so at a very early age, I had the desire to look at the world and craft a vision of it.
So I wonder, in the writing that you do or the teaching, I mean, it takes a lot of courage, right, to be able to ask those questions or to write where there's no rules and experience that freedom. How do you work with people, or how do you work within yourself to have the courage to write from a place of either brokenness or beauty, and to delve into the freedom that poetry offers?
I think I've gained that courage from the participants at Healing House, because I don't come from an addiction background, and they do, which means they have delved into their deepest self to find out why they're addicted and how they'll overcome it. And so when I'd say, write something about your pain, or what's something that was painful for you, it's amazing what they will share. And I'm thinking, I'm the coward here, not them. They are so brave to share who they really are and what they really want. And it's beautiful.
Yeah, to agree with what Ann is saying, I think the key point is the going into your deeper self. I think poetry scares people. You frequently think that it's something that's not accessible to you. But I think for me, it's an opportunity to go inside, to look inside, to journey into yourself, and come out with an interpretation, a view of the world around you. And in a music sense, it's your inner music is how I approach it.
And so I wonder too, so what is the connection between poetry and spirituality for you?
I appreciate Miriam sharing that, because one of the ways that I got in touch with my love of poetry, which has really happened now, is whenever I sit quietly and listen, I will hear something, whether it's an instruction or a memory or an original idea or an idea for some writing that I'm doing. And my mind will just take that and go and add to it, and as if my mind is writing it, not my hand. And that, I think, is, for me, it's a form of prayer. And it's nothing I can control. I don't try to control it. I could stop it, but I don't like to stop it. I want to see what it has to tell me. And becomes a very, very spiritual experience. And again, if I want to share it, I can. If I don't need to. So it can become private or public.
Yes. I'm glad to have the opportunity to sit here and talk to you all about poetry like this, because in class we can't do this, but I did write something, and like I said, I am a closeted poet. Every time I write something, I don't know, poetry tries to seep into it. So I want to read to you what I have to say about this, my spiritual connection to poetry and writing in general. Writing for me is to bear witness, to put down on paper, to participate in a narrative that reaches, I hope, to something divine, and to further creation. To me, it's like a breath. It's to breathe a rhythm into a pulse that reverberates throughout the universe. And I feel, it makes me feel like I'm a part of a larger organism, something that's beyond the intellect. And that's the spirituality of poetry and writing for me.
Yay.
I can't say that in class. People will say, what?
Thanks for sharing it with us.
So for folks who are new to poetry or perhaps intimidated about dipping their toes into the water of either writing or reading poetry, do you have any words of wisdom for them? Any advice about where to begin with poetry?
Well, I would say, as I tell the class, think of two words. I am, this is, what if, and then add to it and keep going. You can always throw away those first two words if you don't like them, but it gets the mind going and comes up with usually something very profound and very spiritual. It's magic. It's spiritual, it's prayer.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd say come from here, your heart, and your gut, and let them dance.
Wonderful. So my last question for you is, do you have a favorite poem or poet? Favorite poem or poet to share with the congregation?
I like Mary Oliver very much, and thank you for bringing one of her poems with you this morning. I also, I also like what Nikki Grimes writes for children. She's a very good poet. And I like simple poetry. I don't like to have to read it many, many times to finally understand what it might mean, as you can tell by my choices. But I'm more willing to delve into the depth of some of the classics, and that's a good sign.
Wonderful.
Let's see. Well, I don't have a favorite poem or a favorite poet, but the first poem that infused me is Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. Just that, the line, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. I mean, it's such a visual. So.
Wonderful. Well, as a way to close, Ann has brought a piece of poetry from one of the participants in her workshop, and so I invite you to hear these final words.
This one is called My Addiction, and what I did was invite the participants, and I always invite them. This is not an assignment, this is an invitation, to write to their to their addiction and about their addiction. And we used a form called diamante, which means you write on the first line one word, second line is 2 words, third line is 3, fourth is 4, and you keep going till you write 10 words, and you can see the shape of it. You've got a triangle now. And then you start backwards, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you end up with a diamond. And it's helpful for me and for them to have a little construct or a little prompting, a little puzzle to go with. And this is a diamante that was written by a Healing House participant named Lisa Ray. Her last name starts with J. That's how we always identify ourselves, with first names and last initials. So she's talking to her addiction as she begins it. What, 1 word, is wrong? 2 words. Where did you go? You stopped singing your song. Your light hid, the light hid in your eyes. You were telling yourself all those lies. You stopped seeing the beauty behind your smile. You stopped walking with me all those miles. I'm coming for you. I'm running to you, my God. A story to tell. Sorry I fell, my God. You are now the one I crave the most, my new high, the Lord of hosts. In your name I pray, thy will be done.
Oh no, I forgot to copy the second page. Whoops.
Something like, thy will be done. Thank you, God. Amen. It's almost like a benediction.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Miriam and Ann, for being with us this morning and sharing. Let's give them a round of applause. So friends, poetry can help to form us, and like prayer, it can help us to pause, to connect with God, to hear the inner voice of God that dwells within each of us. As you leave worship today, at each of the entrances, there are a couple of poems that we have cut out, and we invite you to take 1 or 2 or 3 with you and to put them around your house, perhaps in your bathroom mirror or by your coffee maker, and throughout the day to take a few minutes to pause, to pray as you read that poetry, or if you feel courageous, to write a poem of your own. Thank you both.
Thank you.